Hey everybody. So now that we are into the season a little bit here, I want to talk about something that is always fun to talk about and fun to speculate about, and that is coaches, particularly coaches getting fired. So now obviously only a week into the NHL season, it is way too early to be firing your coach that you had enough confidence in to at least start the season with. And I don't expect to see any coach firings, in the very near future. However, as we get into November and certainly into December, depending on how the season is going for some teams, that is when we really see things pick up with the potential for coaching changes. So before we get to that point in the season, I want to speculate a little bit and talk about who I think could be the first coach fired in the NHL this season. So I have a few different candidates, and then I'm going to talk about some dark horse candidates who might get fired this year, who maybe aren't the first people that come to mind, but depending on how the season goes and if things go wrong, they could end up being sent packing. But let's get right into it, starting with who do I think is going to be the first coach fired in the NHL this season. And for me, there is a clear and obvious number one candidate for this. It is Bruce Boudreau from the Minnesota Wild. I was actually fully expecting Boudreau to get fired after last season. Minnesota finished last in the Central Division last year. They were expected to be a playoff team. They had a really bad season. And I thought Boudreau was going to get canned at the end of last season. Didn't happen. However, they stuck with Boudreau through the offseason and into this year. However, I don't see Minnesota being much better this year than they were last year. They haven't won a game yet, even though they're only 2 games into their season, but they haven't won yet. And I don't think it's going to take very much or very long for Bruce Boudreau to get sent packing from the Minnesota Wild. He is my clear number one candidate to be the first guy fired this year because I think his seat is already boiling hot. Another thing to add on top of that is the Wild have a new GM in Bill Guerin. Paul Fenton was fired over the summer, and Bruce Boudreau is not Bill Guerin's guy. Bill Guerin came in, has taken over the GM role with this team, and I could see him wanting to get his coach in there, his guy in there, as quickly as possible, especially if the first month or two of the season doesn't go as the Wild hope. And I don't think it's going to. I don't think the Wild are a very good team. I think they're going to finish last in the Central Division again this year. And that means Guerin is going to be looking to make changes. And I think Boudreau will be on a very, very short leash, to say the least, to start this season. And he's my clear number one pick to be the first guy to get canned. Number 2, another option that I think could certainly, depending on how this largely depends on how their season goes, is John Hines of the New Jersey Devils. 2 years ago, the New Jersey Devils made the playoffs, and Hines was talked about as a potential Coach of the Year candidate. Last season, they showed a massive regression and ended up finishing last in the Metropolitan Division. This summer, they made a bunch of changes. They brought in PK Subban to, add a dynamic playmaker to that defense core. They traded for Nikita Gusev from Vegas to bring in another goal scorer. They drafted Jack Hughes 1 overall. New Jersey is expected to be good this year. New Jersey is expected to be good and expecting to be a playoff team. So far through 3 games, they have not won a game yet. They are 0-2-1. Now, obviously, it's still very, very early, but their defense has not been good. They've given up 16 goals in 3 games. They've only scored 6. And if this continues for the Devils and they end up being a huge disappointment this season, I think it is very, very possible that John Hines gets canned and is fired at some point during the year this year. Again, if New Jersey turns things around and goes on a decent little win streak, then I think his job is safe. But if, given the way that they've started, I think his seat is going to start to heat up. And as we go deeper into the season, if New Jersey's still, well out of the playoff picture, or, not performing at the level that they were expected to perform this year, I think Hines' seat is going to get hotter and hotter, and he's definitely a guy that could get sent packing this year. And lastly, my third coach that I have that's already kind of on a hot seat is John Tortorella with the Columbus Blue Jackets. Now, Columbus, I don't think what's going on with Columbus is necessarily John Tortorella's fault at all. I think it's much more on the GM, the fact that they couldn't sign Bobrovsky or Panarin or Dzingel or Duchesne or anyone that they lost this past offseason, and that's much more on management than it is on the coach. However, somebody's got to be the fall guy, and more often than not in the NHL, the coach ends up being the fall guy. So if Columbus, they were a playoff team last year, if they end up being a 7th or 8th place team in their division and they are really struggling partway through this season, I could very easily see Tortorella just taking the blame and getting canned, and him being fired, even though I don't think it's really his fault what's happened there. They lost so much in free agency this offseason. Somebody's got to pay, and oftentimes it's the coach. So if things go this season the way I think they are for Columbus, I picked them to finish last in the Metro this year. I think if things go that way, John Tortorella is going to be looking for a new job. And he's a coach that generally has a short shelf life to begin with, just because of his coaching style and his attitude and the way that he is. He never really sticks around in one spot too long. He was with the Rangers for a good amount of time, but they had some very, very good teams there. Generally, as soon as anything goes bad where Tortorella is coaching, he's very quickly sent packing. And I think this could be a really tough year for Columbus, a real regression year for Columbus. And I think if that does happen, then Tortorella is going to be fired. So those are my top 3 picks for the first coach to get fired this year, with Bruce Boudreau being my clear and away number 1 candidate for that. Now I want to talk about some dark horse picks. I think guys that maybe don't immediately jump to mind, but could be in trouble if their teams don't perform this year. One of them is Jeff Blashill from the Detroit Red Wings. Steve Yzerman's in there. He just came in this past offseason and has taken over the role as the main manager of that team now. Blashill's been in Detroit for a while now, since Babcock left, which is a number of years now. If Detroit doesn't show signs of significant improvement, I think Blashill could very well be out of a job, and Yzerman will try and get someone else, one of his own guys, in there to take over. Now, Detroit is still a very young team. They're not expected to be good yet. They're not expected to be a playoff team yet, but they do need to start showing signs of improvement. And I think if they're a 7th or 8th place team again, like they were last year, Blashill could be in a lot of trouble. I think if they do show improvement, if they start to win some games, and those young players start to show signs of progression, and the team gets a little bit better, and it looks like things are still moving in the right direction, I think they might stick with Blashill and let him ride out the rebuild, and then see where things go from there. But I think if things stall out, he could very easily be gone. Another guy in a somewhat similar situation, I think, is Rick Tocchet in Arizona. Arizona really, almost made the playoffs last year, but still were a little bit a ways away. They're another team that needs to show signs of improvement, and if they don't, I think Tocchet's job could be on the line. They're a team that should be competing, maybe, not making the playoffs now, but at least competing for a playoff spot until the end of the season, and at least being in the playoff conversation. And if Arizona doesn't do that, I think Tocchet could end up getting canned by the Coyotes, and they could go in a different direction. And lastly, so I think a lot of you are going to say what when I say this name and be a little surprised by this and probably think I'm an idiot. But Mike Sullivan in Pittsburgh. And hear me out on this. Let me explain. Yes, Mike Sullivan has won 2 Stanley Cups with the Pittsburgh Penguins. But the Pittsburgh Penguins as an organization are never shy about making moves, not only with the roster, but with coaching as well. This is an organization that makes drastic changes and makes them very quickly. And we've seen them as one of the most active trading teams over the past few years. And quite honestly, if you look at what Pittsburgh has done and the direction that they're headed in, 2 years ago, they lose in the second round of the playoffs to Washington. Okay, they got beat by a team that's very similar and just as capable as them in a very good, long, hard-fought playoff series. Then last year, they get swept in the first round by the New York Islanders. So obviously a major regression from Game 7 in the second round, losing in overtime, to getting swept in the first round. That is a major step back. And now, to start this year, they're having major injury trouble. They're 1-2 to start the season. They got blown out 4-1 on home ice by Winnipeg the other night. Now, I don't think Sullivan's firing is imminent. I don't think it's anything that's going to happen anytime soon necessarily. But if we get to mid-season and Pittsburgh's out of the playoff picture, or if they're a 500 team, a middle-of-the-road team that's not really playing all that well, they're not afraid to make moves. That's an organization that is not afraid to make moves. And I think firing Sullivan would be something that's on the table if this team isn't a playoff team again this year, and something that I think would be considered. So while I think it certainly would be shocking to see Mike Sullivan get canned by the Penguins, it's not something that's completely out of the realm of possibility depending on how this season goes for Pittsburgh. So those are my dark horse candidates for potential guys that get fired this year: Mike Sullivan, Rick Tocchet, and Jeff Blashill. My top 3 candidates are Bruce Boudreau, John Hines, and John Tortorella, depending on how the seasons go for their particular teams. But it could be someone else as well that we don't know, although I think a lot of the teams that were going to make coaching changes in the near future made them after last season. But we'll see how this plays out. It's always fun to speculate. It's always fun to look forward to try and predict and see what happens. But I think Boudreau definitely has the hottest seat right now in Minnesota, and it might not be long before he is out of a job there. But with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media. All those links are down in the description below. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our Patreon and merchandise store are down in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.